Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomi Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomi. What is Atomi? It's an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific video and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. Our goal is to help make life easier for our teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you want to find out more about Atomi, head over to our main site at getatomi.com and feel free to try it out for free. Today, I was joined by Alex Quigley, National Content Manager at the Education Endowment Foundation and published educational author. We discussed the reading and vocabulary gaps that exist in our schools today, the reasons behind them, the problems they cause, and what teachers and policymakers alike can do to close these gaps. If that sounds like your kind of thing, feel free to subscribe to us at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you do your podcast listening, and we'll never say no to a quick 5-star review. In the meantime, give this episode a listen, and I hope you enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon, and today I'm joined by our very special guest Alex Quigley, National Content Manager at the Education Endowment Foundation, author of several educational books, and curator of the Confident Teacher blog. Welcome, Alex.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you bright and early on this this Wednesday morning. It's one of the earlier recording times that we've had on Brainwaves. But hey, the right way to start the day. Am I right?
Yeah.
Quick podcast before doing anything else.
Yeah. So it wakes you up. Certainly wakes you up.
Exactly. It certainly does. And we'll be woken up with some hot topics today, a kind of an amalgamation, I guess, of two topics which you've written about extensively and have plenty of wisdom to share, which is closing both the reading and vocabulary gaps, something that really provides the thrust of a lot of the work you do. But before we get there, as our regular listeners will know, we always like to start with our guests by getting just a brief run through of your journey in education to date. So, where it started in terms of teaching and in the classroom, and what were the events, what were the decisions along the way that kind of led to you branching into different areas of education, such as, your writing and the blog and all the rest. So if you can, please give us a run through of your educational journey.
Yes, so about 18 years or so ago, I trained to be a teacher in North Wales, and I basically would have taken a job anywhere, but I found a great school in York, Huntington School, and I joined as a secondary school English teacher. And to be honest, for the first 2 or 3 years, I found it quite a challenge, the kind of just the behaviour, the workload, the marking of endless essays, but I grew to love it quite quickly once I kind of settled in. And I think just for 7 or 8 years, I was just a kind of, regular teacher, didn't have many designs on leadership or certainly not writing about teaching. I was just, busy getting on with the job. And then about 7, 8, 9 years in, I did get interested in school leadership. I ended up becoming a middle leader and running a large English department. And then I found this thing called Twitter. And joined Twitter and just started to see how there were lots of voices, people I kind of recognised from my teacher training and Dylan William and these kind of people who were talking about education and talking about teaching. And I was in a role which was quite a high pressured leadership role, and it felt like they were offering me a bit of a lifeline. They were offering me some really good advice and effectively kind of joined that conversation. And then over time started to just write a blog as a teacher, just kind of how I was teaching that week, things I was thinking about in terms of education, and actually just doing it week after week after week, it just started to gain a bit of a following, which was great. And then I was asked to write a book for new English teachers, and it kind of spun from there. I ended up doing quite a bit of writing and articles. My leadership journey carried on, ended up moving into senior school leadership, and then got involved in a large scale trial that I led within the RISE project, which was about training school leaders to engage with research. And part of that meant that I was getting involved with researchers with this kind of national picture and then international picture with the Education Endowment Foundation. And then I think just kind of step by step, I kind of moved into that world of writing about teaching that bit more and just moved away from the classroom that bit. And I think there is a point where you've just got to kind of lay your bet and kind of go all in on one piece of work rather than, try and do 3 or 4 different roles. And so I joined the EEF and I've been at the EEF now for a couple of years for the National Content Manager. So I help make sure that we've got really high quality resources that are really teacher friendly. So a big part of my last 7 or 8 years has been around accessing these answers and insights from research evidence, but too often they're not written very accessibly for teachers. They're not adapted. Teachers don't have time to look at them. And so I felt like, teaching such an important job, the evidence is helpful. And so if we can just make those adaptations, if we can support teachers with time and tools, and then actually we can do a better job for people. So it's opened up a really different part of education for me. It's really quite exciting. So there's aspects where I work with schools across the country and the EF's Research School Network, but also really interesting connections across the world even. So yeah, it's really, I still love teaching and education. I just now support teachers from the outside pretty much.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating and kind of a unique journey. And just before we kind of move into exactly what that supporting teachers involves, I think it's just it's fascinating to hear how you talk about how Twitter was a bit of a springboard for you, and mention some names. Dylan William, who's someone who's actually we've had on the podcast before, but Twitter, I guess, is something which maybe this is just to do with the change over recent years, is something that in modern times maybe can get a bit of a bad rap at the moment, and can be viewed as a place where it's difficult to have the sort of stimulating conversations that can give rise to opportunities that you're talking about. But it sounds like you managed to find that there. Would you say that's something more to do with the time in which this occurred, or more to do with the educational community on Twitter?
So I think some people are quite vocal about criticizing social media, and there's a lot to criticize. So if you're no fan of Donald Trump, then Twitter can be a challenging place sometimes. But I've always found it quite similar in that if you want to have an argument, you can go and find an argument pretty quickly. But if you want to create lists that are really useful in terms of specific topics and groups and areas of interest, which I do, then actually you can make it a really rich place. So what I do, I've got lots of friends I speak to on Twitter, so it has become an aspect of my social life. And I now meet a lot of those people in real life. But also I find a lot of new research come through Twitter. So I've created lists, I mute people, if I feel like, they use Twitter in a way that kind of just sucks the life out of my day. So like anything, it's how well you use it. And I think Twitter may have been, really dynamic and new 7 or 8 years ago in terms of an education community. But I think it's even better now because there's an even wider range of voices, and there's a democratic element in terms of if people are saying useful, interesting things, if they're writing, if they're making connections, then it just, it's democratic in that way. You don't have to be, a professor of a decade standing like Dylan William to engage in these really interesting conversations. So, for me, it's about how you use it. And I think it was great 6-7 years ago for me. It's just as good now. And I curate it to make sure it stays that way.
Yeah, well, it sounds like definitely a very positive approach, and you're getting the best out of a relatively modern service in what is Twitter. But we're going to pivot, I guess, to something that's not quite as modern, that's been around quite a lot longer, which is this idea of the reading gap, which is something that you've written about quite extensively. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of closing the reading gap, which is of course the aim of a lot of your writing and the work that you do, I was just wondering if you could first give us a breakdown of exactly what the reading gap is, what it is, the factors behind it, and how it kind of manifests in the classroom throughout various ages and stages for students.
Okay, so I often use statistics that are based in England, but it's fair to say that this is a challenge and an issue that's common across Anglophone countries around the world, so Australia, US, England. So I think the reading gap, it precedes COVID and our most recent challenges, of course. And if you put it in really basic terms, it's a gap that starts really early, and it's an opportunity gap in terms of some children get to read with their parents on a daily basis. And because of all that rich early reading and dialogue and turn taking around looking at books, those children are better prepared when they get to nursery, when they get to reception, and when they begin school ultimately. And we know, quite depressingly, that already some children are much more prepared for early reading in school because of their experiences at home and outside the school gates. So that reading gap is one of experience, and it's one of being able to sound out words and kind of just lift the words off the page. But as you move through school, that gap doesn't really change. So, by the time children become 8 or 9 or 10, actually then they have what's in the US called the 4th grade slump, where they start to read more complex books with more complex vocabulary, and they don't quite have the skill and the background knowledge to read confidently when they're 8 or 9. And then, it's a depressing fact that the gap doesn't change. The word rich, the reading rich get richer, the reading poor get poorer. And so as you go throughout school, we know that reading just gets more challenging, more academic, more complex. And therefore, the better prepared you are to read, that allows you to succeed in school, to access the school curriculum. And I think one of the related gaps is that teachers don't quite have in-depth training. We know this from studies in Australia, in England, and in the US, that teachers don't feel very confident when pupils aren't strong readers. And so there's a gap in terms of, if a child has got to 11 years of age and they're not a great reader, teachers aren't quite sure what to do. And so it seems to carry on. And in England, some of the statistics are really chastening and quite obvious. And we have, at age 15, a big sample of tests by GL Assessment, where they tested over 300,000 English children. And it showed that a quarter of 15-year-olds had a reading age of 12. Now, when you just put that plainly in terms of what that means in the classroom, that means that a good number of pupils in every single classroom are going to struggle to access the texts that are a standard part of the curriculum. So this is a daily basis that some children just have gaps in their understanding. They don't quite read it fluently, they don't quite understand, and so on each day there's these small little defeats that students are having, and then that becomes more obvious when they take national exams and they don't quite perform as well as their peers. And so this reading gap is something that starts really early, It doesn't, unless we address it, it just carries on and it grows over time. And so the solution has to be, we have to understand the problem first. We have to know what this gap is, and then we need some really skilled, teaching to try and address it. It's not an easy thing to close, because one of the issues with reading, of course, is it happens outside of school. And if you own books, if you have a literate environment where there's lots of talk and lots of reading and talk about reading, then you're better prepared for the classroom. So it's not some easy silver bullet, we can give a child a book and, that kind of turns everything around. It's something that has to be systematic and has to be addressed, as a priority for the school and by school leadership.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think when we're talking about the importance of the reading gap, I think one thing that also is a factor is, if you were to compare with, for instance, hypothetically talk about a maths gap, let's say a gap in the maths classroom, well, obviously that's a problem and that's something that needs to be dealt with, but you could almost say that that's something that's maybe self-contained to the maths classroom. Perhaps it has some spillover for maybe some of the science subjects, but by and large it's something that is contained within a maths classroom, whereas a reading gap is something that's, okay, its biggest impact is going to be in English, but you've got to read for all your subjects, so would it be fair to say that the reading gap is something that's kind of causing issues for students in all of theirs, or at least most of their subjects?
Yeah. One of the arguments I make in the book is it's really clear, the evidence that reading in science is one of the most significant barriers for attainment. So if you think about the language of science, it's so complex. All of the the complex terms that are from Latin and Greek. Actually, if you can't read really fluently, then reading a science worksheet, a science textbook, it's really difficult to follow. And there's good evidence that shows that your literacy levels correlate really strongly with how well you do in science. And then we often assume, English is where the greatest impact is. But then if you think about mathematics, doing a multi-step word problem, ultimately you need to be a fluent reader so you can find the maths. And actually you need to just make it automatic, like driving a car, that you don't have to think about the language, and you need to get to the mathematics and the procedural steps. So reading and mathematics matters. And what I've argued in the book is that actually, as children get older, they start to have to move into this very subject-specific reading, and reading becomes slightly different in science and in history and in English. Because if you think about it, when you're reading in history and you're comparing two historical sources about a world war, you read in a very specialized way. So you're trying to corroborate between the different sources, which is reliable, which is a better, capture of that point in history. And then you think about English and you think about poetry. Well, actually, you're not corroborating between sources. You're not necessarily often thinking about, the author or a historical moment. You're looking for metaphors. You're looking for layers of meaning. And then you go to mathematics and you're looking for a really logical sequence and steps. So I think too much of this is actually hidden to most teachers, because we get away with it. We can teach our subjects competently, but what happens when a quarter of your class don't read very well? And what happens when those barriers emerge, and as a history teacher or a science teacher or a maths teacher, you're untrained, and in fact, you don't really even see the problem. You just think that, some people switching off and they're just distracted, when actually they can't fundamentally access your subject that you love so much. So for me, I try and make an argument that literacy and that the reading gap, they go far beyond the English classroom. And actually, you can learn to read, and that's critical. And primary school teachers, do a great job of that. But you go on to read to learn. And unless every teacher in secondary schools and of teenagers understands how you read well, and how you do that in different subject domains, actually, we see those losses in the classroom. So that's a key argument for me, that every teacher is a teacher of reading, and the reading gap has an impact in every classroom.
Hey folks, hope you're enjoying the episode so far, and we've got plenty more to come after this quick break. Here at Atomi Brainwaves, we're all about education, and not just for students, for ourselves too. We would love to hear from you, whether that's feedback on one of our episodes or a question you'd like to see answered by one of our guests or by Sue. So, if you've got a comment or a question, don't hesitate to email us at brainwaves@getatomy.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, let's get back to it. Yeah, no, absolutely, and it really hammers home the complexity of the problem and of dealing with it. And however, I'm going to ask you next to, dive a little bit into that complexity and talk and speak a little bit about, the strategies that can be used to combat this, to try and deal with the reading gap. And I'm going to ask you maybe to break it up into two sort of segments. Maybe talk about, first of all, what specific teachers can do within the classroom. I know obviously there are different levels to this. There are teachers in primary school classrooms versus then the challenges for teachers in secondary school and different subjects and all the rest. But if we're to crudely break it up into, a micro and macro level, the first would be the micro teachers within the classroom in front of a group of students dealing with this problem. And then the second beyond that, the macro, would be, policy measures that can be taken at a higher level with regards to curriculum, syllabus, and that kind of broader umbrella dealing with the issue. So first off, what can teachers do in the classroom to try to close the reading gap?
Okay, so I think let's start with younger children briefly, because I think we can't not consider the actual foundations of reading start young, and that there's a lot of reading science out there. It's one of the most studied areas of educational research, and for younger children, we know that a program of structured phonics is a really strong platform, because ultimately you need to decode those letters and sounds. You need to be able to lift the words from the page, and then you need to become fluent in doing so, and fast and fluent and a skilled reader. So that's something that for primary school teachers, they need to be, strong at doing. But actually, we have, a too large a proportion of children who go throughout school and can't decode very strongly. So there's something about addressing that. I think as you move through those younger ages and you move up into, child becomes 9, 10, 11, and I talked earlier about that they start to read more complex texts. I think there's a couple of things there. So one of the things is that every teacher can be aware of reading fluency. So if you think about what that looks like for us and for adults, it's when you read aloud from a page, it sounds a lot like talk. It sounds natural. And that's when you're a fluent expert reader, and then you can put emphasis on certain words. If you're reading as a character, you can put all those extra elements in. But for a lot of students, we sit next to them in the classroom and we ask them to read a page of a story, or we ask them to read a part of the textbook, and it's a bit stop-start. They're not fluent. And actually, I think we can, on a really small basis, just focus on fluency. So one of the things is being a teacher modeling fluent reading at the front of the classroom. That's an obvious thing. Every teacher does it. We don't even think about doing it. But then we might have to improve our pupils' fluency, whether they're 5 or 15. We might have we do some choral reading where students read with the teacher. We might have some paired reading where actually, rather than the focus being on the teacher kind of getting through the text, that the students read to one another, and they just, they reflect on how well they're reading. And we think and give them the language of, fluency, which is about pace, it's about stress and rhythm. So there's a little bit of teaching there, but ultimately it's paying attention so every child can read fluently. Because if you can't do that, and you're 14 sitting in a geography classroom then you're going to struggle to keep up with all of your peers. And then I think a big factor, and again, it's not like we don't do it anyway, but paying really close attention, is the developing the knowledge in our curriculum, this cumulative, rich background knowledge that means that pupils can comprehend complex texts. And so what that means is from, as early as you can, it's having a really coherent, well-structured curriculum with reading really at the heart of it. So if we take history, then if you're not reading, a lot of historical sources, probably some of them at a greater length than in the textbook where they're snipped into little short elements, then you're not going to have that experience of reading like a historian. And you've got to, have a real rich experience of reading, and probably more than sometimes the curriculum mandates. And I think one of the paradoxes of our curriculum and our teaching in the classroom at the moment is we try to make things accessible, to make the curriculum accessible. We chop things up into PowerPoint slides. We actually take away the experience of reading complex passages and textbooks, and we make it easy, and we kind of disembody those words with an image on a PowerPoint slide, and we try and explain it. Now, I get that sometimes that's necessary. You don't maybe dive into a Shakespearean play without first breaking it down into small steps. Yeah. But I think part of the problem at the moment is that we can do that too much and never actually scaffold into the complexity of reading difficult texts. And we keep on trying to make things easy, but then you sit in an examination and you can't access the exam questions, you can't access the complexity of the text. So there's something around having the curriculum really well connected, lots and lots of rich, complex reading, scaffolded through. And yes, sometimes we need to break it into small, accessible steps, but then actually we need to make sure we walk into that complexity and we give our students the tools to do it. So on a really micro level, a teacher in English, in history, in mathematics can be more deliberate about teaching how you skim and scan a text. And, that very notion, which is so automatic to all of us adult expert readers, we just skim through the text to get a sense of what type of text it is, key information, and then we scan for, usually the most important information, the nouns, the verbs. We go hunting down what the core of that text is, and then we read it more carefully. Now, the problem is here that a quarter of students in every single classroom do that naturally without being taught. And yet remember that quarter of children whose reading age is years below their actual chronological age. They're not using those reading strategies. And so, yes, we can work on the big picture of the curriculum, but also on a daily basis, we can be thinking about how we read to the class and how they read to us. And we can be thinking how we teach them to be strategic readers. And that just goes for skimming and scanning, even rereading, just these small micro things we assume every student does, but actually the evidence indicates they don't. There's a lot of poor comprehenders out there, and they don't do a good job of reading texts in the classroom. And I think on a policy, big picture level, and I think this is true in all the kind of Anglo-speaking countries, that actually there's something here about training teachers about this challenge. It's more complex than we assume, and actually that comes down to teaching new teachers, but also sustaining this. And then there's something around the resources around reading. So, books cost money, kind of technology cost money. So there's something here around this is something you can, address, but it needs to be well funded, well supported. And if you remember, I talked around this starts before children ever get to school. So there's something for policymakers around not just early education, but actually supporting parents and families before school ever starts. And that early intervention is proven. If we get it right early, it offers the solid foundations children need. And I can talk about when I get onto the vocabulary gap, but we know that, how you perform age 5 is strongly matched to how you perform as a teenager. So we need to try and close the gap early as we can.
Yeah, no, it's a really comprehensive outline there of what can be done. Just to very quickly touch on the last, I was literally about to ask you, and you preempted me there about this idea of what can be done, if anything, to encourage that literate environment at home outside of the classroom, because it's obviously that outside of classroom environment is somewhere where teachers and even educational policymakers have that much less control. But can you think of anything in specific that possibly can be done to encourage greater reading at home, both before, maybe even in a child's early years, but even then, obviously, as something consistent throughout, particularly the early years, but all the way through their schooling? Just any particular measures that maybe could help make that more of a reality, which then has great knock-on effects for the child's schooling.
Yeah, so I can, but I also don't want to overpromise, because this is a complex, multifaceted social issue, and so there's no easy fix here. And governments have tried this, tried to tackle this problem before. And in England, and similar programs elsewhere, we had the likes of Sure Start, which is about supporting parents before they get to school, and there's some elements there of book gifting and helping parents around early talk and language development. I think going back to similar programs is probably what we have to do. We just have to learn from that past evidence. And I think things like book gifting are a good example. So you can, for 1 in 8 disadvantaged children, they don't own a single book. So play that back to their their earliest childhood. There's unlikely that there's a lot of reading in that household, because it's just not part of the household. There's a generational gap here around reading skill. And so if you're not owning a book, you kind of go early on. Book gifting some books is probably going to be a good start, a good thing you can do. But what we know from the evidence around book gifting is that just giving a shelf full of books is never enough, because those parents and caregivers need some training and some ongoing nudges and help to make that reading happen. And often there's a cycle of intergenerational kind of issues with literacy here. But I think giving the books, then offering ongoing nudges. We know things like sending text messages seem to work better than other modes of communication. And I think if we start small and before children ever get to school, with the gifting of books, support for parents, social kind of groups where they're doing this, that's a factor. And then when you get to school, I think one of the benefits of being a teacher is that, in primary school, you have that child with you for 7 years, and you have the same in secondary. So you can build that relationship and partnership with parents. And actually, I think that's where you can really get great work done in terms of this ongoing, steady support with reading. So I think schools can make a difference here. It's shown to be the case, but having that partnership with parents matters. I think all my reading of the evidence says that the biggest impact we can have is in the classroom. And so sometimes it's about making the best bet. I'm not saying we ignore parents. I'm not saying don't give, gift books or support that. But what I am saying is we need to channel our energies, because, there's limited capacity in schools. And if we get early reading right, if we focus on reading practice in the classroom, then reading outside the school gates, helps itself as we move forward. So I am talking here about making a best bet, and that best bet is supporting the teacher to do a great job teaching reading.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, making a best bet, I guess, is the best that any of us can hope for in handling any issue, but doing it based on the evidence and the research, as it sounds like, 100% is where you're coming from, is absolutely the way to go. And I'm sure you're going to have similarly well thought out descriptions and potential aims to deal with what I'm going to ask you about next, which is, of course, the vocabulary gap. So I'm sure, as one can surmise from just the name, that there's going to be some degree of overlap between the vocabulary gap and the reading gap, but naturally enough, also some degree of difference. So I was just hoping you could speak to, in a similar way, what the vocabulary gap is, how it manifests itself, and I guess the key differences between the vocabulary gap and the reading gap. And then again, after that, we'll get around to what schools and teachers can do to deal with closing this gap.
Yeah, so if I first offer an analogy to connect the two, the reading gap and the vocabulary gap. So I want to offer you the image of a Russian doll. So I think the large Russian doll is literacy, and that involves, language development, talk, reading, writing, vocabulary. And then, one of the smaller dolls is the reading, and then you get yet smaller, and probably the smallest is vocabulary. And why I talk about the vocabulary gap and why it's really powerful in the research evidence about it is actually you really hone in on the problem of literacy. Sometimes it's just too big a problem. We got talking about parents and families and before school and, all of those, that big social challenge. And actually, I think it's really helpful to zoom right in on the words. And it's something that's visible. It's something really tangible for teachers, because you're always teaching your subject and the curriculum, but on a very basic level, you're teaching a lot of words. And so for me, it's actually something it's the same social issue as reading. It's about literacy. If you don't have the vocabulary, then you don't succeed in school. And that's just a really simple match. And we also know, like reading, that a vocabulary gap, for similar reasons actually, starts early and it doesn't seem to close over time. And there's what's called this Matthew effect, which I've described, which is the word rich get richer, the word poor get poorer. So if I just go back to earlier on, I talked about the difference in reading before children ever get to school. And I think language and vocabulary particularly is often given a biggest boost through reading, but also through talk. And all of that turn taking with parents and caregivers, some of the best turn taking and vocabulary happens when you read with a child. And that vocabulary, mushrooms early. When children are 2 years of age, they start to have this boom of language, and it's exponential and it grows, and it's really critical for early school success. And it's something that actually has become a bit of an international area of interest in the research, and certainly for governments around the world recognize that, this vocabulary gap's a thing. And I think if we go back to the 1990s in the US, researchers Hart and Risley conducted a study, and it was quite a small study actually with 42 families. But they recorded an hour a day of every day before children got to school. And then they analysed that language, and they noted that depending on your family, and they matched it with your family background, your wealth and social status, basically some children heard 30 million more words than their peers. Wow. And it was called the early catastrophe, for obvious reasons. But what it struck at was that some children have a very different experience of early language than their peers. And as I stated earlier, that has a fundamental impact on your readiness on day one of school, but also on, day 1000 of school as well. And I think since there's been a lot of challenge to that original research, and we've just got better technology to record that language and to record that vocabulary. And in the replications, in the studies that have followed in the decades since, we've got better technology, and we've shown that the gap probably isn't that 30 million words, and of course a lot of that's repetition, but the gap is probably smaller, and it's probably in the millions. But what this evidence has repeatedly shown is that there is a big definitive gap in vocabulary experience, and then that means you're ready or not to sit on a mat in year 2 and hear a story being read and you access that story. And then in year 5, you're sitting down and you're doing a maths problem and you've got the vocabulary to access that maths problem. And this is where you can see how it feels a bit like a mirror image of the reading gap, because it is. The vocabulary is couched right there as one key thread of reading. And then again, we see this other match where the older children get, the more specialized vocabulary becomes. And I mentioned the words in science. So many of the words in science actually are really complex, and you don't ever hear them in daily talk. You don't hear them on TV. You don't hear them on YouTube. They're actually really specialized. And quite a lot of that vocabulary is archaic. It goes back to Greek and Latin origins. And so you have to teach it quite deliberately. You have to treat it differently than normal language, normal talk. So this, effectively, what I describe in the book is there's an academic code, and we need to help pupils crack that code because it's not their daily language. That's not to say how they talk with friends is any less valuable, but it's very different to the language and vocabulary that will help them succeed in the classroom. And so we need to get better at understanding all the nuances about teaching vocabulary. And actually, there's some really practical steps. There's some good ways to kind of break it down, to think about it in your curriculum, to pre-teach vocabulary. So again, it's one of these things that it's fundamentally at the heart of every teacher's experience and every pupil's experience. But for too many teachers, it's probably something that's a bit invisible. And certainly it might be visible in terms of pupils are struggling, but they're not sure what to do about it. And so I like that small Russian doll, perfectly formed, because you can address vocabulary much easier than you can other issues and challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely a good analogy for, if you'll pardon the pun, breaking down the differences between the reading gap and the challenge it poses and the vocabulary gap. Although would it be fair to say it does sound as if, there's a lot of nuance in the difference in terms of the strategies that you can employ to tackle both of these issues. There are, a good degree of similarity between what teachers can do in dealing both with the vocabulary gap and with the reading gap inside their classroom.
Yeah, I think so. I think they can match up. You've just got to know what the problem is for each of them and make sure you marry them up. So if you're addressing the vocabulary issue and teaching vocabulary explicitly, that makes reading more accessible. However, if you're thinking about reading in history, it's not just the words, although they are obviously critical to understanding. Also, there's some elements of the type of text you read in history is different, sentence structures. There's other factors to reading which make it a bit more of a multifaceted problem. And that's why I like starting with vocabulary, because it's a bit of a simpler, straight to the heart of the problem, straight to the heart of knowing the words, knowing the background knowledge is knowing the world, and that helps with your reading. So, yeah, marry them up. Probably start with vocabulary. It's a bit of a simpler access point, and then get to the slightly more complex problem of the reading gap.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a degree of nuance, I guess, for teachers to have to navigate to separate the differences and to figure out how to deal with them. But definitely, following the advice of those such as yourself and that which the research indicates can definitely help them get there. However, the last thing I'm going to ask you today is I'm going to throwing another variable into the mix, another curveball that unfortunately all of us, no matter what your walk of life has had thrown into their life, which is of course, current factors caused by the coronavirus pandemic. It's had such a knock-on effect for so many walks of life, but for education, that has meant virtual classrooms, limited face-to-face class time. Perhaps you're only having certain numbers of your class on given days, and poses so many issues for teachers to try and overcome. But I guess, under our umbrella terms, under what we're talking about, the reading and vocabulary gaps, what are the challenges that current factors have thrown up for teachers in terms of dealing with closing these gaps, and what can teachers do to deal with them? I know, obviously, this is still such a new situation, such an ongoing changing situation. So, worry not. I'm not expecting, silver bullets. I'm not expecting perfect solutions to what are very difficult and relatively new problems. But I guess just any advice you would have at this point to teachers in terms of closing both reading and vocabulary gaps in, I suppose, for want of a better term, the new normal classroom.
Yeah. So we don't know the exact impacts, but I'm not massively optimistic because if you're one of those quarter of children who is struggling to read anyway, then not having your teacher, give you that expert instruction in person is not going to help. So, we can recognize that it's not a good situation. I think, again, this is about teachers knowing what the problem is and therefore better addressing it. So one of the issues with remote teaching is that there's much more of an expectation for reading from a screen. And what we know from the research evidence, I've written about this for people who want to chase it, kind of the background to it, is that reading on screen is more challenging than reading from paper. That particularly with non-fiction texts, that when you're reading on screen, you remember less than reading on paper and from a book. And we don't quite know all the reasons why. It might be something about, you've got a bit of a different mindset. It might be scrolling. It might be, distraction. We don't exactly know why reading from screen is suboptimal compared to reading from a book or paper, but it is. So there's a small additional problem there. I talked earlier on about reading fluency and having children read to one another and all of that practice that happens in the classroom. Well, doing that remotely is just harder, isn't it? It's just not an easy thing to set up. So there is just some practical barriers for reading. I think there's something, again, fundamental about reading practice. So if you're in school all day, however your day sets up, you're going to be reading quite a lot. And it happens throughout your school day, often in school subjects and parts of the day people don't even think very hard about. And then when you move to, the remote aspect, if there is another lockdown or absence for some, child who's kind of having to take, a number of days because of a test or one of their friends has been unfortunate and tested positive, then actually there's something about how much you read, that practice at home. And if you remember earlier on, I talked about 1 in 8 disadvantaged children in England not owning a single book. Well, then there's something here around, there's a barrier to access. In England, and I don't know if this is true, in other countries, but there's also an access issue with laptops and technology and good Wi-Fi. So we come to some fundamental barriers of, if you haven't got the reading material, then that's going to widen the vocabulary and reading gap. If you then haven't, been supported to read really strategically on screen and all of those little details, then again, there's another small gap that might arise. So I'm not particularly, positive about it. I think in truth, some children will have read voraciously, outside of school during lockdowns, and yet weaker readers probably haven't, and the gaps probably widened for them. So for me, it comes back to the similar solutions. Teachers need to understand the problem. We need to, direct our energies at these fundamental, issues, because you can't access the curriculum or be successful if you can't read or if you don't have the vocabulary of school. So, we can't do everything and we can't compensate for a global pandemic, but we can place best bets and we can focus our energies on things that are going to make the biggest difference. And reading and vocabulary, they feel like, to me, a good area to invest our energy and actually some of our money and funding to make sure there's reading access, there's best practice, and teachers know to deal with this issue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's, as you say, look, a really suboptimal situation for schools, for classrooms, for teachers, for students everywhere. And it's about doing the best we can and making the best choices in difficult circumstances. But so long as, I guess, people follow the expert advice, then we've got the best chance that we can to do what we can to close the gap and hopefully look towards a future where things return more and more to normal, where, as you say, more and more good work can be done. That is going to wrap it up for our main conversation around closing the reading and vocabulary gaps. However, before you go, as our regular listeners will know, we always like to ask our guests just to finish on a quick hot tip for the day. So this can be a little fun piece of advice. Maybe it's a short anecdote that you picked up from your teaching days or from your general experiences in education. It can be very lighthearted, it can be a touch more serious, totally up to you. But just to close us out, a quick hot tip for the day. So what have you got for us?
Yeah, I thought this through. It's not the most accessible tip.
Okay.
But it's one that worked for me. It was the fact that I think when I had children myself, when I became a father, I really began to understand early language that bit better, vocabulary and reading, and I understood this trajectory, that how reading develops. So I think becoming a dad was a great way to help me understand the reading and vocabulary gap and to do a better job. And so, in truth, it would be a hot tip to, if you have your own children, that's a long-term but very effective strategy to be a better teacher. In lieu of that, you might want to pick on a nephew or a niece, or in lieu of that, you might want to read, a book by David Crystal or an expert about how children develop language and develop as readers. Maybe that's more practical in terms of a starting point. But certainly for me, my hot tip is have your own son or daughter, and then you'll be flying.
There you go. Certainly is a hot tip. I'll maybe just stress that perhaps you might want to have a few other reasons as well to want to have but certainly to have one amongst other reasons being getting that grasp on early language. It certainly sounds like a hot tip indeed. So thank you very much for that, and thank you so much, Alex, for coming on, for speaking to us, for sharing your wisdom and your advice. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you, Simon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, I will quickly say thank you to you too for coming on, for hearing us out. If you want to listen to more episodes, you can find them on whatever you're listening to this episode on, and you can check us out at our main site at getatomy.com. For the time being, it's going to be goodbye from Alex.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. Take care.